All right, Barb, you can take it away.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I know it can be so hard to carve out any time during the day. So I'm so grateful you're here, and I hope you're all staying warm because it is Arctic outside. Um, Let me introduce myself. My name is Barb Golub. I am spent over a decade, almost two, as an educator. No, it's been actually more than 2 decades as an educator. I started as a classroom teacher in New York City public schools. And then I was a literacy coach overseas at an independent school. And I've been doing some private consulting now for almost a decade. And that also includes working in my private practice with dyslexic students. So I'm very passionate about this work. A lot of my time is spent in school buildings. I work on a systems level. I work a lot with teachers and leadership to make sure that all instruction is evidence-based and is good for everybody. Dyslexic children are always at the heart of what I do. And if instruction is good for them, I really do believe it's great for everybody. So this is a photograph of me in one of my schools that I work with. You can see I'm working with a small group of children, and around me I've got a group of teachers, and we're kind of fishbowling instruction. I was sharing this slide with my friend Lauren, who's also on this call, just to get a little bit of feedback. And she said, I really love this picture. I'd like love to see you in action with the kids, but no one can see you're not smiling. So I made a revision. Hopefully you can see it. Did you get that? See that little smile? All right. I am also a mom. I also have two daughters. They are 8 and 6, and they attend West Hartford Public Schools. Um, So, our conversation today is about demystifying dyslexia. So, there are three myths that we will really work to undo this afternoon. Before we start that, I do want to make sure that we all understand, have the same understanding about what reading and spelling are, because I think it's really hard to think of what a definition might be. So, in my field, we call reading and spelling decoding and encoding. That's sort of our fancy language for that. So, when we're thinking about reading and spelling or decoding and encoding, we are thinking about decoding as the process where we are turning printed words into meaning. That we understand that what we speak is what we see in text. And that when we are writing or spelling or encoding, we are taking our ideas and turning those ideas into written language. So everything is really based on language, and that will be a running theme through our conversation this afternoon. The first myth that we will work to undo this afternoon is that dyslexia is a vision problem. Before I started this work, this is something I understood to be true, but now I understand it is not true. Dyslexia is very much not a vision problem. Dyslexia, according to the International Dyslexia Association, who actually updated their definition in October of 2025, it was a very big deal. They updated their definition to include this piece here, that dyslexia is the result of underlying difficulties with phonological and morphological processing, that those are common. So anytime you see that prefix phon, that means sound. So phonological processing is the ability to hear and understand that spoken words are made up of individual sounds. We call those sounds phonemes. So there's that root again. So phonological processing is the understanding that words that we speak are made up of individual sounds. This is also a way to think about how the brain handles sounds. So when we consider phonological processing and we understand that it is sound-based, this is work that happens in the brain before letters are even introduced to a reader. When we're thinking about phonological processing, we're thinking about different levels of phonological processing, from rhyming to understanding syllables to understanding sounds. And so those sounds again are called phonemes. And this level here, this sound level, this phoneme level, in my field we call this phonemic awareness. And this level of understanding of individual sounds is an incredibly strong predictor of reading achievement. And on this sound level, persistent weaknesses in this sound level, at the sound level, are a hallmark of dyslexia. That is not all, of course. So we're also thinking about morphological processing. So when you see that root morph, that means form or shape or structure. And morphological processing is the brain's ability to recognize and to use meaningful word parts to understand and to spell words. When we're thinking about morphological processes or processing, we're thinking about meaningful word parts, things like prefixes, those letters that come before a base word that change the meaning. We're thinking about base words, the part of a multisyllable word that holds all the meaning. And we're thinking about suffixes, those parts of words that come at the end of a base word and also change the meaning. So together, when we understand that, when we look at phonological processing and morphological processing together, we understand that this is how a brain processes language, not how eyes process print, right? Together, these processes, sounds plus meaningful word parts, support reading and writing. Now, of course, you may have the same question I get from parents, teachers, administrators, from students themselves, which is, what about B and D reversals? I see them all the time. B and D reversals are not a defining feature of dyslexia. That is very, very important to know. And in fact, B and D reversals are considered typical until about mid-second grade, which does not mean that the day after the middle day of second grade, if a child or student or someone that we know is making a BD reversal, we panic. We don't panic the day after the middle of second grade, right? We take this all in as information. We approach this as from a stance of curiosity. One of the reasons why B and D reversals are so hard for dyslexic readers is because those dyslexic readers and spellers are having a harder time forming stable and automatic connections between letters and sounds, period, between any of the letters in our alphabet and all of the sounds that they make. Why B and D are particularly challenging? Because they are so visually similar. They are very, very visually similar, but they represent very different sounds. So when a dyslexic brain has a deficit in phonological processing, linking those forms with their sounds are much more difficult, right? It's much more difficult. A dyslexic reader sees the letter B and the letter D the same way that a non-dyslexic reader sees them, but the brain is processing them differently because they have not yet linked the form with the sound. It takes longer for people with dyslexia to overcome this BD confusion because their brain is learning how to make those automatic connections, right? Again, we look at this through a lens of curiosity, information. Yeah? So, of course, what can we do at home? What can we do at home to help our kids? Well, one thing that can be very helpful, is to do any sort of work. And by work, I mean play around rhyming or syllables. Like for young children, nursery rhymes are an incredible instructional tool. They don't feel instructional to the grown-up at home. They don't feel instructional to the kid listening to them. They really just are a joyful way to listen to language. But that rhyming, that cadence, very important. Also doing some clapping games, like I clap a beat, you repeat it, also great. Sometimes when I'm in the car with my children, we're on a longer drive, we'll play in the car like a rhyming game. Someone will have to say a word, and then we go around the car. Everyone has to rhyme a word. And the person, the last person who cannot is out, and then the next person goes. These things are, of course, harder to do with older children, like teenagers. In my experience, do not want to listen to nursery rhymes, but we can play music at home and we can dance to the music and we can clap along to the music. That is all helping the brain understand sound and pattern and beat. That matters a lot. I think also at home, I certainly hear a lot from parents and from teachers. How can I help my child with homework? So if your child, well, before I say this, I should also say path of least resistance for anything having to do with homework. So if your child is asking you, how can I read, can you help me read this word? I can't quite read this word, or I want to spell this word and I can't quite spell it. If the path of least resistance is to just give them the word, please just give them the word. If you are feeling brave and you want to try to coach your child through that decoding, that reading, or that encoding, that spelling of the word, you can give them the sounds, right? So, easier said than done, I will say. Easier said than done. So, these are all the letters of our alphabet, and the letters of our alphabet make different kinds of sounds. I'm giving broad strokes here. So if anyone on this call is a speech language pathologist, you know there is so much more to this, and I absolutely defer to the SLPs in my life. One kind of sound that some letters in our alphabet make are called stop sounds. So I've highlighted here the stop sounds. And a lot of times, our children, regardless of age, and I would say grown-ups too, dyslexic or not, understand these sounds to have an at the end of it. So a lot of times I'll hear B says buh, D says duh, K says ka, and that is not correct. That sound is actually quite disruptive. These sounds say b, k, d, g, j, like a little puff of air. I tell my students, if you are making those sounds and your chin is dropping, ba, ja, pa, you are not pronouncing that sound. That is really, 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 really good work to be doing at home. We also have continuous sounds. So these are sounds that we can stretch and we can hold these sounds. And this is very important because decoding is a process of blending sounds together. One of the reasons it can be so difficult for a dyslexic brain to process that spoken language has individual sounds is because when we are speaking, the sounds in our words blend together. It's called co-articulation, right? I say a word and all the sounds are blended together. I do not say words sound by sound by sound. I speak word by word by word, right? So teaching our kids, our grown-ups, our teens, teaching anyone to understand that some sounds can be stretched and then blended into other sounds is really important. So these sounds don't say f, o. They say eh. I tell my students, anytime you can hold a sound, you hold that sound, and then you bring it right into the next letter's sound. These are particularly difficult sounds. I find that in my work with parents, teachers, children, there is a lot of confusion around these 5 particular letter sounds. I'm going to tell you these letter sounds, and it might blow your mind a little bit. It melts my brain every time I have this conversation. So the letter Q in our alphabet is never in writing, in reading, is never without the letter U next to it. In English, in our written language, You'd never see Q without U. So Q does not say qua. Q says coo. If you think about a word like quick or queen or quiet, here's how I teach my kids. Let's say the word quiet. Quiet. Stretch it out. Quiet. And then I say, let's take off the it. What's left? Cool. Quiet. That's a big deal. R is another one. A lot of my students come to me and they think that R says ra. R does not say ra. We do not say ra ed. We say red. Same thing. Red. Red. Now take off the ed. R. R. Very, very important work. Even for our typical readers, there's still some confusion around those sounds. W is another one. We don't say wa. Let's think about water. We say water, water. Ooh, ooh. That is a different sound. X is tricky because X is a combination of two sounds. It's like the K and the S sound came together and had a baby. It says x, x, unless it starts at the beginning of a word and then it says z. It makes the sound of the letter Z because our language isn't confusing enough. And then the last one that I find to be quite confusing for children, grown-ups, and everyone in between is the letter Y. So Y, I hear a lot from my students. Y says ya. Y does not say ya. Think about words with Y. Young, yellow, yesterday, yesterday, yesterday. Now we'll take off the yesterday. Ye, yesterday. It's not E like the long vowel E. It's ye. That is very significant work. Very significant work. And if you are feeling brave to do that with children of any age at home, go forth. My students in particular that I work with do have trouble with BD reversals. It is quite challenging for them. And so this is a tool that I give them. This hangs on my wall, and when they need it, they reference it. I find this one to be more helpful than the bed analogy. A lot of times my students will come to me and they'll draw a bed, right? And so like the head of the bed is the B and the foot of the bed is the D. But you flip that bed around and the letters can flip around too. It's not concrete enough, I find. But if you are playing baseball or softball, you have to hold the bat before you hit the ball. So my kids know bat before the ball. And if you are opening a door, you have to touch the doorknob before you access the door. So they know doorknob before the door. Super, super helpful. I have one of my students, she and I, this is week 12 for us, and she relied, when I saw her, she relied very, very, very heavily on these tools that I've given her. And now she doesn't even look at them. It's all been internalized, which is a very big deal. Not because she's memorized the pictures, but because her brain has more efficiently attached the sounds with the forms. It's a very big deal. Okay, next myth to undo. Dyslexia cannot be diagnosed until third grade. Incorrect. Dyslexia can be diagnosed very early. And in fact, this is part of the IDA's updated definition as well, that dyslexia also encompasses early oral language weaknesses. Like we can look to early oral language or expressive language weaknesses, again, just as a clue, not a panic, but as an indicator that there might be some literacy challenges later. One of the things I think is really, really important here for all of us to understand, I remind myself about this all the time, is that we don't need to wait until children struggle or fail to give them the right kind of intervention. And dyslexia can be identified before reading instruction, before formal reading instruction even begins. I'm going to say that again. Dyslexia can be identified even before formal reading instruction begins. We don't have to wait until our children struggle or until our children fail. And the truth is that waiting only delays targeted instruction. And targeted instruction is most effective when it's provided early because those brains are plastic. Oral language and dyslexia are closely related. They are closely related. However, they are not synonymous. They are related, but they are not the same thing. And they are related because they both draw on language systems. Because dyslexia, remember from our first myth, dyslexia is about language processing. It's not about visual, right? And this is why I get this question a lot from parents that I work closely with. Does dyslexia happen in other languages? Dyslexia happens all over the world. It happens in every language. It happens even in languages that are picture-based, like Mandarin or Japanese or Korean. It happens everywhere. We here in America use American English. It has a very we have a very deep language. So there are more sounds and forms to connect to each other. In some other languages where it's more phonetic, there's still a lot of work to do, but it's not the same depth of orthography of writing system. So again, I want to share this next bit of information as just that, information, right? Many, but not all young children who grow up to have dyslexia or have dyslexia, and we don't find out until later is maybe a better way to say it. Some clues that you might find. You might find that these young children have trouble putting language into words, or they might have trouble finding the right words. They have the idea, but they can't connect the idea to language. It's more challenging for them. We might also see young children giving short or vague answers. And not because they want to give those answers, but because they can't get to the language that they're trying to say. We also might see young children, mixing up sounds in spoken words. So my teaching career started in a preschool, and I remember I worked with a 3-year-old boy. He was in my class, excuse me, and he would mix up his L's and his Y's. So he would say lello for yellow and yunch for lunch. I didn't know back then what I know now, but that is certainly, again, just another indicator. I would have approached it with a different kind of curiosity had I known back then. Oral language difficulties might also show up as young children needing extra time to explain things, even when they know what they want to say. Right? So again, this does not mean that every young child who has expressive or oral language difficulties immediately has dyslexia. That is not what this means because there is so much variation in how children grow up learning to speak, but we want to gather information. Knowledge is power. Oral language difficulties are also not failures. Dyslexia is not a failure. Oral language difficulties are not failures. We take this all in as information. So I'm going to walk you through the brain a little bit, and I am not a brain scientist by any stretch. If anyone on this call is, press mute because I'm going to say things that maybe are not the most scientific with the most scientific language, but I look at a brain through the lens of reading and how the brain learns to read. So here you see some brain scans. On the left, you see a brain scan of a dyslexic reader, and on the right, you see a brain scan of a typical reader. Now, in the reading brain, the reading starts in the front part of the brain. So this I like to think of as the phoneme producer. So when you, anyone of any age is looking at text and you see the letters on the page, your brain is starting to analyze those letters and link those letters to their correct sounds, right? We're starting to analyze the smallest units of sound. So you see the word pencil in your book, and your brain is going s, I, o, right? This part of the brain is especially active in the brains of young readers, 5, 6 years old. Some kids learn to read earlier because they are learning just the very first thing that these shapes on the page make sounds. And those sounds are the same ones that come out of your mouth when you're speaking. So this part of the brain is particularly active in the brains of young readers. Once the sounds have moved through, they then go into this part of the brain, the word analyzer part of the brain, where the brain is creating more complete analyses of written words. The brain is, pushing and pulling sounds, continuing to do that. The brain is thinking about syllables and pronunciations, and the brain is continuing to link letters and sounds, and maybe even in larger units of letters and sounds. Then the word moves all the way to the back of the brain into the letter box or the automatic detector. Before I tell you about this part of the brain, it is fascinating to me to know that this part of the brain is not something we are born with. This letter box in the back of the brain is something we develop through learning how to read, which is unbelievable to me. This letterbox is really, really critical to reading because it allows for the automatic process of storing written words. When a typical reading brain is reading text, it moves through that pathway from phoneme producer stored into the brain's letterbox for automatic retrieval in 250 milliseconds, which I could not understand. I was like, okay, that is fast. Yeah, that sounds fast. And my mentor said, that is faster than a heartbeat, which I like still can't wrap my head around. The more this part of the brain, this letterbox, the more it's activated, the better it functions. So the more we read, as a typical reader, the more we read, the brain will just start to move those words into that letterbox. So when you see a skilled reader reading, it looks like they're not even working that hard, but they are. Their brain is just moving really, really quickly. Skilled readers breeze through this with it's like an assembly line that is working incredibly, incredibly efficiently. But in dyslexic brains, that high speed assembly line breaks down and it prevents the brain from easily getting words to the back. They stay in that phoneme producer. They don't quite get to the word analyzer or the automatic detector. That's where the assembly line starts to break down. And what researchers have found in dyslexic brains is that this phoneme producer is overactivated because dyslexic brains are not wired to connect letters and forms automatically, letters and sounds automatically. So working so hard to do that stays in this part of the brain. And when you listen to a dyslexic reader read, that you can tell they are working so hard. I mean, I see my students, I always say like nobody works harder than a dyslexic reader. Period. Nobody is working harder than a dyslexic reader. It is so effortful and it is really sound by sound, right? My readers, I am working to help them move to more automaticity with reading from that sound by sound reading. It's just not efficient. And what happens is we spend so much energy, our dyslexic readers spend so much energy in this part of their brain, they start to compensate in other ways. So I have some dyslexic readers that I work with, and they will sometimes guess at words or they will use context to read the words. But that is all compensation. That is not really reading, right? This also helps us understand why spelling can be extraordinarily difficult for dyslexic people. Spelling is hard anyway. Spelling is hard. And developmentally, it always comes after reading, right? Decoding happens first, spelling will then follow. It is extraordinarily difficult for dyslexic people to spell because they're working so hard. Sound, letter, sound, letter, sound, letter. This is very important because, I think like a sub myth here is that um, if only, the dyslexic reader would try harder, if only they could, work harder on their spelling, they are working at 100% all of the time. Their brains are wired differently. And what's fascinating is that researchers are able to see this in children as young as 6 months old. There is a reading scientist, researcher, Nadine Gabb, and she looks at the brains of very young children between the ages of 6 months old and 17 months old. And she and her colleagues are able to see these differences in dyslexic brains in these babies. It is unbelievable. Now, the good news is with the right instruction, a dyslexic brain can start to look and function more like a typical brain. It will never fully look and function 100% like a typical brain, but it will begin to, and that is very good news. Sally Shaywitz, who is another reading researcher, she's here in Connecticut. She heads the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity. Through her research, which is very, very, very long term, she has this very famous study called the Connecticut Longitudinal Study, and where she followed children from grade school all the way through adulthood, dyslexic children. And what she found was that with evidence-based, systematic, diagnostic instruction, 2 sessions once a week, no, 1 hour twice a week for 2 years consistently starts to change the brain shape and function. That is unbelievable to me. 2 1-hour sessions a week over a few, right? This takes years. It's not a 1 year kind of deal. It takes a few years. And the later a reader is diagnosed with dyslexia, the longer it takes, right? So I see all of my students right now are third and fourth graders, and I have some high schoolers as well. None of them were diagnosed until later, so it's going to take longer. I think this statistic is like 4 times as long versus if they were getting that kind of intervention very, very early on. So there is support out there. There's good support out there. But just know if the child is diagnosed later, it will just take longer. So what can we do at home to help? Well, one thing you can do is if you are the parent of a dyslexic child, regardless of age, you ask questions. You ask questions like, please tell me a little bit more about the intervention that you're using. What does that look like? Is it evidence-based? I would love to see some of your materials. Like, help me understand what an intervention session with my child looks like. I think it's also really helpful to ask about progress monitoring and what that should look like, right? I think for someone who's dyslexic, 2-week progress monitoring is good. 2 to 6 weeks, some like very intensive progress monitoring because the instruction has to be diagnostic. So, what does your progress monitoring look like? Can you please share that with me? I would love to just get an email touch base with you every X amount of weeks just to help see how that progress is going. One strategy that I work on with my dyslexic students in my practice is we practice this finger spelling. So I tell my kids, like, you have these tools with you all the time. You have your fingers on you all the time, and your fingers can help you decode, read, and your fingers can help you encode, spell. So if I'm doing work with them and they come to a word that is difficult for them to read automatically, right? They can read it accurately, but they can't read it automatically. I help them. So we say the sounds, sound by sound, and then say the whole word. So it might look something like, I'm just looking around, the word, I don't know, the word the, right? The word the, which comes up a lot in text. So we will look at the word and say, the. We will put up a finger for every sound that the letters represent on the page. The same can be done for spelling. So if a child says, when my children at home say, Mom, can you help me spell this word? I'll say, what is the word you want to spell? And they'll say something like, my 6-year-old is obsessed with mermaids right now. So she'll say something like mermaid. And I'll say, great, let's go syllable by syllable. The first part of that word is mer, mer. Okay, what are the letters that match those sounds? Write them down. Second syllable, made, aid, made. Great, write those letters down. It's a great tool, I think, especially for older dyslexic children. What I hear from them and their parents is that they are hesitant to use any tools in the classroom that nobody else is using. Not that anybody else is caring, but they care a lot, right? Nobody else notices, but they notice. So using finger spelling for reading and for decoding and encoding, everybody's got their fingers. We're all using them all day long. The work I do with my students is multisensory, which means I give them a lot of kinesthetic input. They're touching things, they're holding things, they're tapping sounds into their bodies, not because that multisensory is how we learn to read, or we learn to read through our brains, but it gives them some additional input and it hooks them into that learning. So my dyslexic students require a lot of repetition. So giving them those additional modalities helps hook them into that repetition. But any sensory input is good. Shaving cream trays, shaving cream in the bathtub, playing with dough, helping cook and bake, like all of that information, all of that sensory input is really, really good for a developing brain. And our brains develop forever, right? They keep going on and on and on. All right, and then we have this myth here, which is that dyslexia is the same for everyone. And as I've been working with dyslexic readers for some time, I say, I can put 40 dyslexic people into a room and I will have 45 different ways that dyslexia manifests for them. It is a fingerprint. It is so, so specific to the individual. Dyslexia absolutely is not the same for everyone. Even siblings who have dyslexia, not the same for the siblings. This is also part of the new IDA definition that these difficulties occur across a continuum of severity. So there's a very, very wide variation of how dyslexia manifests in an individual. One way we can think about it is from mild to severe. And when we think about mild to severe, we think about things like persistence of a challenge, right? So for someone for someone with mild dyslexia, we might see subtle challenges with reading fluency or subtle challenges with spelling, or they might be, inconsistent with their accuracy of reading words correctly. Someone with a more severe case of dyslexia, someone with more severe dyslexia, it's those same things. They're just a little bit more persistent. The difficulties are more persistent. What we find with mild dyslexics when they are young, kindergarten, first, second grade, If their instruction, if their whole class instruction is evidence-based, they're usually fine. They don't need any sort of outside intervention. So the state has been working really hard to make sure that that is going on in our public schools, which I'm very grateful for. We can also think about dyslexia in terms of the type and number of deficits. So one single deficit dyslexia, when we hear this person has single deficit dyslexia, we think, okay, this is a person who has trouble with what we discussed earlier, phonological processing, hearing and working with sounds. That is single deficit dyslexia. Double deficit dyslexia is phonological processing, right? Hearing and working with individual sounds, and also retrieval. It's sometimes called phonological retrieval or rapid automatic naming is what we call it in the biz. But really what we're talking about is the speed at which a brain can retrieve information. So I'll give you an example. Another one of my students has, I believe, I'm not a diagnostician, but I do screeners and I'm working with these children really intensely. And I believe she has double deficit dyslexia, is my understanding. The phonological processing is effortful for her, and she's slow to retrieve. It looks like this. I will give her three words. I'll say something like dog, dinosaur, dust. What sound do you hear at the beginning of those words? And the response goes like this. D. This child will get there, but it takes an extraordinary amount of time. Anything over 3 seconds is considered a slow processing speed. The good news is she is now processing under 2 seconds. So she is, again, no one's working harder than a dyslexic reader. There's also triple deficit dyslexia, which is phonological processing difficulties and retrieval difficulties, and something we call orthographic processing, which is just a fancy way of saying holding letters and letter patterns in long-term memory. So I have a different student who I will be working with them really intensely on, this letter or this letter pattern. And then I will see them a week later, and we kind of have to start from scratch, right? Until those get locked into long-term memory. Mild, severe, single, double, triple deficit, those affect reading speed and spelling and accuracy. They do not affect intelligence. They do not affect motivation, and they absolutely do not affect persistence. So that is the good news. I've also recently been asked by parents, what does dyslexia mean for other content areas? Because reading is all day. Reading and writing are all day long. You're reading in school, you're reading at work, you're reading at soccer practice, you're reading at the movies, you're reading at the restaurant. It is all day long. So, because there is so much variation and because dyslexia is a language-based deficit, of course it can affect any task that relies on language. It can, but that doesn't mean it does, but it can. So we think about multi-step math problems. That's a heavy language load. Scientific explanations. That's a heavy language load. Following complex directions. That is a heavy language load. These things might be harder for a dyslexic brain, not because the work is hard, but because the language load is so heavy. This same parent asked me about her son's dyslexia and executive function. So when we think about executive function, we're thinking about three core executive functions. These are sort of the root of everything we do in our lives, reading or not. Reading, swimming, cooking, eating, writing, all the things. We think about three core executive functions. One is working memory, the ability to hold on to information. Another is impulse control or inhibitory control, being able to uh, ignore any distractions. And then cognitive flexibility. If something doesn't go my way, okay, I can like pivot easily, right? In dyslexic people, again, because there's so much variation, it can appear weaker. It doesn't always appear weaker, but it can appear weaker in dyslexic folks, but is often thought of as a secondary effect. The weaknesses in executive function are a result of the effort, intense effort that a dyslexic brain is working through, right? Because language processing in a dyslexic brain is inefficient, of course, it makes sense that there would be extra strain on working memory, attention, processing dense information. Of course, that makes sense. What can we do at home to help? Well, one thing that's really important is to prioritize patterns over labels. I tell my parents that I work with, um, it is really important, and I tell my teachers this too, right? Because they are also they're so close to the kids, right? They see those kids 40 hours a week. Notice what is hard for that child. What is difficult? What feels easy? Where is there difficulty that's surprising given this child's like high intelligence level? Notice patterns because when we notice patterns, then we can think about what do we do with those patterns. Labels are not always so helpful. I believe this to be true for everybody, and especially dyslexic readers. Everything counts as reading. Audiobooks count as reading. Graphic novels count as reading. Comic books, magazines, blogs, all of it counts as reading. I often say to teachers and parents, as long as the text is age appropriate, you have my blessing. Let's go get all the books from the library. If you are a parent of a dyslexic child, regardless of age, and that child has a diagnosis, I think it's really helpful, and I encourage you to have conversations about that. What is their dyslexia? What does that mean? What does your brain do? So that your child can learn to advocate for themselves, to feel proud of what they're able to do, and to understand that the hard work that they do each and every day is actually like is their superpower because a lot of people hard work we give up, but those dyslexic readers they are not giving up. I also want us to remember that most children and adults with dyslexia are able to read. Not only are they able to, they can become terrific readers. Even if that reading is on a basic level, they are thriving. Here's some, I mean, I couldn't, there were just so many when I typed in famous dyslexic people, just so many popped up. I couldn't even fit them all on one slide. Dyslexia is an invitation for access to the world. It is not a block. So I want us to remember that too. Thank you so much. We have some time for questions. Here's all my information. If you want to get in touch, if questions come up later, you can always find me. I am happy to email anything that I'm able, any support that I'm able to help with. But we have some time for questions if anybody has any questions.
There's no chat questions, so
Okay.
everyone is able to unmute if you have a question you'd like to ask out loud. I just ask if you do unmute, just remute yourself just so we don't get any of those house sounds in the background.
I had a question. I was never diagnosed with dyslexia. I'm 43 now, but I had trouble like someone asked me to spell a word out loud, and I have
Mhm.
trouble thinking of what the order of it is.
Mm,
Or if I'm writing down like 138, I put down like 183 or something like that.
mhm,
But I read a lot. Like I don't have trouble reading. It's just like
mhm,
trying to figure out like putting my thoughts and the letters in the right order. And I have
mhm.
to think of them and then say them. or like sometimes I'll mix up the numbers on when I'm writing on something. Like one time I wrote down a phone number wrong. My mom kept calling the phone number. She's like, "Did you reverse the 7 and the 8?"
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting, and it's I would say that that is quite typical if we think about again, even in the most traditional sense of how reading develops over time, reading and spelling. Spelling always comes a little bit later. Uh, it's always second in line. So it makes sense that if your brain is working so hard to remember what you've heard and then attach letters to it and then attach sounds to it and then the letters and then move that through your arm to write or through your fingers to type. Yeah, it makes sense that there might be some reversals there.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. And um, it makes me think about working memory and like what kinds of, working memory is a muscle. If we don't work it out, it will get weak. So just like with any muscle, so what kind of working memory work can we do? I often say like games are really, really good for working memory. Any sort of game that requires holding on to information. Card games are really good for flexing that working memory muscle because you have to remember a lot of things. I also think that some of the New York Times word games are also very good for working memory because you have to remember not just the rules, but the guesses that you've done, the guesses that didn't work. So anything like that can be really good for working memory.
All right, last call for questions. All right. Well, I think,
Oh, hello,
oh,
hello.
okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't know how to raise my hand virtually. My name's Heather. I just wanted to thank you so much for giving us this talk. I do have a dyslexic son, and it gives me a little more understanding into what he goes through daily. And I have to be honest, some of these words they use in these meetings with me, I don't fully understand. So I appreciate your explanation. I'm really happy to see schools go more towards evidence-based learning.
Thank
And I
you.
wondered what your thoughts are on like maybe specifically how well do you think kids integrate into the higher levels? Do you think that having Orton Gillingham trained people in the schools
Mhm.
obviously that would be helpful, but how important do you think it is? Because I think there's a lack of that. And you know, my school, my son is at a specialized school right now, but it's very far from where I live. And I know it can't go on forever. So,
Mhm.
um, just integrating him back in without having anyone, I don't think really having anyone with specific training in teaching dyslexic children, in
Yeah.
particularly where I am now.
Yeah, I think it's really critical for teachers I think anyone who is in a close relationship with not just dyslexic children, but children, period, in an educational setting, absolutely, because, I understand that what is critical for dyslexic readers is good for everybody. So, I will say too that I was just thinking about this morning that dyslexia is quite prevalent. It's about 17% of the population, 1 in 5 people. So if you look at a classroom of 20 kids, that's a good chunk of children who
Yeah.
have something of dyslexia, right? Mild, severe, double deficit, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, so we're in this space right now where I think there's more awareness is starting. It's nowhere
Mm-hmm.
where it needs to be. Do not get me wrong, but it is
Mm-hmm.
starting. I think
Mm-hmm.
I think when your son transitions into a larger gen ed population, then there are certain requests you can be making on your son's IEP.
Mm-hmm.
I often counsel parents that I work with. You must request You must say in writing, I want an evidence-based program like this one or this one.
Mhm.
I think
Mhm.
it's really important for teachers to be trained. Um, they don't Listen, I think it's wonderful if they can get to the certification level, but at least to be trained can be very
Mhm.
helpful. And there are some
Mhm.
programs out there that I know some schools use
Mhm.
where the materials are accessible enough for teachers. Of course, it is gold standard to be trained, but you can kind of read the
Mhm.
manual and like do it,
Figure it out.
right?
Okay.
But yes, I mean,
Mhm.
my dream would be for every teacher K-12
Mhm.
pre-K-12 to at least have an understanding of Orton Gillingham. Yeah.
Okay.
But
Okay.
yeah, I would say be as specific as you can with what you
Mhm.
request, um,
Mhm.
and continue to ask the questions. Like
Okay.
be
Thank you
a
so
partner, be a
much.
partner with your son's teachers. You're welcome. Thank you so much. Get in touch with me, Heather.
Yeah,
We can always talk some more. I'm always
I
happy to
will.
answer
Thanks, Barb.
questions.
I
Of
appreciate
course.
it.
Sure, of course. Oh, another Barbara who's a speech language pathologist. Oh my gosh. Wow, impressive. Some of the smartest people I know.
Mhm.
All right. Well, I think that's everything for today. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Barb, for the presentation. It was great.
Of course.
I will be sharing the recording later today, so you'll have that. And yeah, thank you again. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you. Bye. Bye. Okay.
Bye.
Thanks.